Marcel, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here.
Yep. Enjoyed our conversation to this point before hitting record. So excited to dive in with you and talk kind of all things profitability and everything else that you have going on, because you do a lot of work with different types of professional services firms and agencies. I thought where we could start is kind of going back, because you spent about 4.5 years at Goldfront, which is a creative company, right? You were in San Francisco. And I'm wondering, is that where you start to see kind of an opportunity for agencies to focus more on profitability? Or was this idea and interest in really understanding profitability, did that come somewhere else?
Yeah, so it's interesting because Goldfront was really like our first major client at Periquito. So I kind of started exploring this problem space. I'd met Josh, the founder at Goldfront, after I'd started the podcast. I'd started the podcast to start talking about this because I'd noticed that there was nobody else really going deep into this area of the business. Josh and I met through that, and Goldfront being a fully remote company, as a Canadian on the East Coast, the other side of the continent, that gave me the ability to get in and start working with him, and was really able to get into the weeds at Goldfront in a way that, we couldn't otherwise do with the services that we do at Periquito. And so those 4 years really, informed a lot of learning, and it was really great working closely with Josh, and a lot of his ideas and opinions informed some of the products and services that we designed over those 4 years to really form Periquito.
Yeah, we're going to talk. I want to get us like quite tactical so we can add a lot of value for everybody to just really understand. I mean, there's likely a lot of stuff that people are missing when it comes to profitability and just ways to optimize or improve their consulting business. But before we do that, I want kind of take me back to the early days of your business and when you were getting started.
Yeah.
Was the plan from day one to kind of become specialists in this area of profitability, or did you have a bunch of different services and ideas and kind of things that you want to take to market, or how you want to work with firms? Or was it very clear from day one, profitability?
Yeah, the problem was clear from the start. And the way that this all happened was one of my first businesses was an agency. I was doing virtual real estate tours back in 2016, before the technology existed to do this with your cell phone. And that was a time when on the East Coast of Canada, it was a buyer's market. Houses were sitting for a long time. They were not selling for much money. And so I was running into challenges with the fundamental unit economics of that business, where it was like, it takes me 30 hours to do this, and real estate agents are willing to pay maybe $300. So clearly I can't scale this business beyond anything but being a hobby for myself. So I was familiar with the challenges of trying to just get information on how to calculate things like gross margins and utilization rates for agencies and professional services. There's all kinds of different definitions everywhere you look, and it's not really clear what the right framework is. And then fast forward a few years, I got involved in software, and a mentor of mine that we both know, Dan Martel, he called me up, and he knew I was kind of looking for my next thing. And he said, I have a friend, his name's Jared. He runs an agency out of Boise, Idaho, that does software development. And he's got an idea that every agency and consulting firm I've ever talked to needs. So I get on the phone with Jared, and he explains to me that, because he was running at a much larger scale than I'd ever run at, he says, look, my team spends like a day or two a week building spreadsheets, pulling data together from all over the place to get us this basic information that we need to make decisions like, what is our utilization rate? What's our forecast? Which clients are profitable? And he's like, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And I can't help but think that everyone else in my position is struggling with this. So I said, yeah, I'm familiar with this problem. Let's go talk to more agencies. We spent a few months just cold calling and interviewing agencies from all over the country, and everybody I talked to was struggling with this. And so the problem was very, very clear. Now the solution, that's 3 years of work trying to figure out product market fit, which is a little bit nascent, as you know, and elusive. But the problem was clear from the start, and the positioning got refined the more we had a dialogue with the market and better understood the language that they used to describe that problem and their experience of it.
Yeah, I love that you didn't just say, here's an idea, let's go build it and see what happens, right? You actually engage the market in getting that feedback. That's an area that a lot of people struggle with, right? So they know they should probably be talking to more people, but the idea of actually getting on the phone, to some can feel daunting, and to others, they kind of begin down that path, but aren't necessarily as successful as they'd like to be. So I'm wondering, take us back to that time where, you have that conversation with this agency owner in Idaho, and you guys say, okay, yeah, let's take this, let's go to market by getting some more feedback. Let's like validate our kind of hypothesis. What did you actually do to get people on the phone? Like, why would other agency owners be willing to give you the time of day when, did it sound like, I'm wondering, like, were you positioned as you're trying to build something for them, or like, what were you doing to get people to feel comfortable to say yes to getting on a call with you?
A great question. And after I explain this, I'd love to share the insight on, while tactically we did everything right, the mental framing that I had
Hmm.
wrong that cost us like 3 years and probably $500,000.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Yeah.
So the first thing I decided was, yeah, we have to talk to agency owners. And we did actually have a concept. We wanted to build a software platform that pulled data together and then reported on these things. And the idea was, it'll pull data in from all these different sources that they're already using and then, run the reports. So I got on clutch.com, which is, this big website that has reviews for thousands of agencies all over the world. I built a scraping bot. I scraped it. I paid somebody on Upwork to get people's email addresses. And I started sending anywhere from 200 to 300 cold emails a day. And the email that I figured out worked the best was stroking the ego and asking for advice. So I positioned it as like, hey, I'm a young person in the industry. I noticed that you've been running a firm for a while. I really respect your work. I'm working on this thing. I'd love to get your feedback. Would you be open to jumping on a call and giving me some advice?
Hmm.
And I was able to book anywhere from 2 to 3 meetings a day using that cold email because, and looking back, it makes sense. If I get that email today, it's very hard for me to say no because I remember what it's like to be that young entrepreneur that's trying to get
Yeah.
started and looking for advice. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of got those initial calls.
Before you go on, because I know you want to share some other piece around like the mindset piece, but I'm just wondering before I forget that it sounds to me like you're saying that the youthful, like that the I'm young angle was a big part of what made this successful. And so if you could clarify, like, do you think that's the case? And if so, what about everybody else who might be joining us right now going, well, I'm not that quote unquote young anymore, so I can't use that. What
Yeah.
might they be able to use to get a similar, response?
To be honest, I can't tell you how much of the young factor actually was part of the decision making process. Like, did it make the strategy more effective? Maybe, but was it, a 10% improvement in the
Mm,
response rate that I would have gotten or 100% improvement? That I can't say. But what I can tell you is that from experience, even from that point forward, the angle of stroking someone's ego and then asking for advice is generally a very good way
yeah.
to get a response, get some people on the phone because generally people are kind-hearted, they want to be helpful, and if you position this as like, I think you have expertise and I'd like to benefit from it, most people don't get those emails every day. Don't get those asks every day. Even the people that you
Mm,
would think would be inundated with those kinds of things. And so,
right.
yeah, I would encourage somebody to try it out because I feel
Yeah.
like regardless of your age, if you write that email well and you do it very personalized and you research somebody and it's genuine, that it should be effective, or at least it has been for me since that time. Now that I'm not so young anymore.
Yeah. So I got to ask you on that again before you kind of share the rest of this. How personalized were those emails? If you're saying 200 to 300 a day, I can just imagine that there's, you're probably personalizing like the name of the person, the company name,
Yeah,
maybe one other field that you can merge in somehow. But
yeah.
beyond that, like, so can you kind of just explain, yeah, how personalized and custom were these messages that you were sending out?
It's a great question. So when I was first trying to figure out what email works, I was writing them all one to one, going on people's LinkedIn's, their websites, figuring this out.
Mm,
Once I figured out the email that worked and the personalization that seemed to like catch people's eye was there was a line in there about like, I'm working on something in this area. I don't know if they taught you about that at, and then I put in the name of the school that they went to.
oh,
And
nice.
so that was kind of this niche piece of information that is not going to show
Hmm.
up on like a bot list. So once
Right.
I figured that out and started getting responses, then I went and hired a person to build the list and gave
Right.
them some tips on how to find what school people went to. Generally, it was on their LinkedIn. And
Yeah.
that's how I then leveraged up that personalization. But this has always been my thesis on cold email. It's not something that we do today at Periquito, but at some point, I'm sure we'll go back to doing it. But it's like write the unignorable email, the 11 out of 10 email, and then figure out how to build the list because otherwise you're just always going to be trying to write within the constraints of what information you're getting on that initial list. And it's going to end up looking like everybody else's emails and just
Yeah.
get ignored.
That's such an
Yeah.
important part because I think, yeah, today so many people are thinking about how can they like automate and make things more efficient. And what they're missing is that oftentimes it's not about volume right away, right? It's about value. So creating that email or that message that really differentiates you from everybody else. Because if your message is, as you just said, Marcel, if it comes across and somebody just instantly looks at it and goes, yeah, like you're clearly sending this to like 100 or 1,000 other people. If it feels like that, the response is likely to be very low. So I love that you put more personalization. Okay, so I've pulled you away from you said there was something from a mindset that could have saved you 3 years. So look, take us back to that.
Yeah. So when I look back, we did everything right technically. So we got on dozens of customer development interviews. We validated the problem up front. People that seemed interested, we were like, "Oh, hey, do you want to, pre-buy the software, be a part of our early adopter circle?" And we got people to pay us for the wireframes that we had for the product that we were going to build. So like on paper, we did everything right. We got paid for something before we built it. But looking back, there were a lot of false positives because I was trying, if I look back at what my mindset was then, I just wanted to build the thing. So I was selling the product in order to prove myself right. And looking back, what I should have been doing was finding the riskiest assumptions in my entire thesis and trying to prove myself wrong as quickly as possible. And I didn't do that. And so, unfortunately for me, I was good enough at sales to sell a product that didn't really have product market fit, build a product that didn't really have product market fit, and go through that cycle like 3 times over 3.5 years until eventually we landed in a place where we let go of this constraint of having to be a pure software company, really started listening to customers in a different way, and kind of removed a lot of the biases that we were bringing to that conversation that we weren't necessarily conscious of as a team. But
Right.
when I really think back, it was coming from a place of insecurity where it's like I wanted to get to the point where we're building and selling and scaling so quickly that I was brute forcing this thing and writing it off as validation when mentally that's not actually what I was looking for. I was looking for proof that I was right as opposed to looking for the proof of what I might be wrong about. And it's
Could you,
nuanced, but that's very important.
yeah, no, so I'd like to go a little bit deeper on that. Could you
Yeah.
maybe offer an example of like, here's what we did to try and just prove that we're on the right track, as opposed to here's what we probably should have done that was something really big that we were maybe just trying to avoid. I'd love if there's a bit of more like a tangible example you could offer.
Yeah. So, like if I went back to the very start, what we did was we created mock-ups of what the software would look like. We got on a call, we asked some questions. If somebody seemed interested, then we would go into a sales pitch, try to get them to pre-buy the software. And once we had 10 of those, we then started building. What I should have done instead was say, "Oh, you're interested in this. Well, would you be open to letting me come in for, some nominal amount of money, a couple $1,000s, get all of your data and do this reporting for you and work with you to like get your feedback and like rather than jumping straight to building the software product, I should have gotten my hands dirty and gone in and did the consulting first." And it wasn't until I got a chance to work with Goldfront that I kind of opened myself up to that possibility. And the learning, the acceleration of our learning when we were able to just get into the weeds and do something that wasn't scalable was 10x what we were learning from this kind of arm's length engagement of build a software, give it to somebody, half the time they're not even using it because they don't understand, but you can't have a dialogue. And it was really painful. So I think I would have, yeah, gone much closer to the problem, gone into the weeds and looked for all of the things that were wrong. Where in my mind, I was like, I just want to build this thing. So I'm just going to sell, we agreed to 10, I'm going to sell 10 and then we're going to build it and then I'll be right.
It's funny. It kind of reminds me of the example you just gave about email, right? Like starting off doing more of the custom personalized stuff to figure out what really works before you then try and scale it. I know there's obviously some differences there, but that makes sense, right? Yeah, because like when you get in the weeds, right, and you're doing the consulting, you're actually finding not only how to just make something work, like as you said, but you're finding like what are all the edge cases or potential issues, or like what are we not seeing that. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you learned that over 3 years, right? That would have been in hindsight a way to kind of go back and make some changes to see results even faster. Fast forward then to you now have 10 clients that have signed up. Once you had that, how do you take this product to market and start getting even more clients signed up? Like what was working for you at that time from I guess a marketing kind of lead acquisition perspective? And then I'm wondering if we fast forward even more to the present day, what are you guys doing today? What are you finding is working best for you to generate, qualified leads and bring in new business?
Yeah. So the good thing that we did early on was we started creating content around the problem space. And so we talk about the minimum viable product a lot when we're talking about startup culture. And I like to reframe MVP as kind of having 4 stages to it. The first is minimum viable problem. So this is the reason that after kind of failing objectively for 3.5 years, we're still around and we were able to kind of stick around long enough to find some success, was because we knew the problem was real. And we knew the problem was real was because we went out, we talked about it, we created content, we published podcasts, we went on other people's podcasts and talked about this. When we spoke to the market, they spoke back. They came and followed our content. They reached out to us. They were interested in what we were doing. We had a dialogue. So we always had that surface area with the market. And what was missing really was getting clear on, so we have the minimum viable problem. Then there's the minimum viable point of view. That point of view was resonating as well, which was, and we kind of talked about this earlier. We used to measure these businesses using only finance data, but that's not good enough anymore. We need to do this different way. People were resonating with that. Then it was process. And that's the part we skipped over, right? So I mentioned we jumped straight to minimum viable product. But I think before that, you have to understand, well, what is the process that solves this problem in a repeatable way? Because software is just leveraging a process to make it happen faster, more scalably, more predictably, more consistently. But I think we're in a rush, and we didn't take the time to stop and say, let's figure out what the process is. And what we overlooked was there is a lot of change management and learning and data structure and all these things that have to happen in order for us to take data from a company and turn it into a valuable report. So it was when we stopped and said, what if we rebuilt this product and this business from the ground up and did whatever it took to make this the best possible solution on the planet? And it didn't have to be profitable, didn't have to be scalable. Like, what would it look like? What would the best solution in the world look like? And when we wrote it all down, we were like, actually, I think we can sell this, and I think we can make it profitable. And when we started selling that, all of a sudden, so we already had leads, we already had, calls booking. So it was just a question of changing what we were pitching on those calls. And all of a sudden, we started closing more and more deals.
Were the leads at that point, were they coming from the content that you were putting out, or was it coming still from the outbound emails that you were sending, or both?
No, we kind of transitioned fully to content. And our strategy was, we created a podcast. We would invite people onto our show. And mostly those are people that we wanted to be on their shows or their blogs. So we just were like borrowing their audience when they came on our show. And then we would build a relationship and get on there. So it was a lot of borrowing attention from other people. That was how we kind of built our initial audience. And we had one lead magnet, the Agency Profit Toolkit. It's the same lead magnet 3 years later. We've changed what's inside the toolkit, but that was kind of what captured people, got them on our email list. And yeah, we've been able to consistently get people requesting sales calls, trials when they were trials, now sales calls when they're sales calls for the last 3.5 years, because we were consistent about that part. And I think that was really our saving grace.
So I know you said, like, from day one, it was very clear for you, the profitability, like just focusing on that. And we will get in just a couple of minutes here into some of the best practice around, profitability and how people can find some areas for improvement. But I can't help but wonder, even though you had that focus and it was clear for you from day one, as you're starting to integrate yourself or go a little bit deeper and build these relationships with these agency owners and so forth, I'm guessing you probably saw and must have had a feeling at some point, like, well, they're not doing X. Like, we could probably help them with that, or we could help them to get more clients, or we could help them to do this or do that. That wasn't necessarily directly connected to profitability. But yet it appears that you always kind of, stayed focused around that core instead of, adding another service or some other, way of engaging or helping the marketplace. Did that ever cross your mind? Or, like, I'm just wondering, how did you process those kinds of temptations as they likely popped up for you?
Of course. I think every entrepreneur deals with this. One of our best qualities is that we see opportunity in everything, but that's can also be our Achilles heel, right? I think that's true about most people that start a business. And that's been true for us as well. We've had no shortage of opportunities to get distracted. But I think our saving grace was that we understood the problem and we had a strong point of view. And so that was our filter for everything. And I have an incredibly experienced co-founder. He's amazing. And so it's really also nice to have that other voice in the room where any big decision like that we're going to talk about. And at least one of us is going to be the sobering voice in that conversation most of the time. And so we've managed to keep each other on track over the years.
Nice. That's great. All right. So let's get into, what are the most common kind of overlooked, leaks that you see companies have in their business when it comes to profitability? What are the big ones?
Yeah. So one of the big challenges that we see is that most professional services businesses don't actually know their gross margins, especially if they're getting financial statements from a generalized accounting firm. But even some of the specialized ones, when we look at their P&L, the thing that's called gross profit on their P&L is actually just their real revenue, because cost of goods sold are generally used to isolate what we would call pass-through expenses. So
Hmm.
expenses that go onto external vendors, such as print budgets, ad spend, maybe external consultants or white label partners and materials, things of that nature.
Right.
And then if they have a team, all their payroll goes into one big bucket. We're not differentiating between how much of that is for doing work and how much of it is for the overhead or administrative functions in the business. And the same thing is generally true about things like software and other tools. We're not differentiating between what is meant for delivery, as we would call it, and what is meant for overhead, which is kind of running the business. And so they don't have an understanding of their gross margin. And that makes identifying what the problem is when there's not enough profit very, very difficult to do. And then from there, the
Mm.
other metrics that determine your gross margin are generally not being measured. So the first thing though is like they don't know if the problem is that they're overspending on overhead and administration, if their service offerings are fundamentally not profitable. And so that's the first place to look.
Okay. Before we go on, let me try and maybe answer a question that some people might be wondering right now, which is the topic of profitability, of measuring, gross margin, profit margin, utilization, all these other things. In your experience, is there a time or kind of a level at which point it makes sense to do this? Meaning, if you are a solo consultant,
Mhm.
2 years into the business, should you even be thinking about this? Or if you have two or three
Yeah.
people, so is there a certain level in terms of either revenue or number of employees, or how do you think about when this even makes sense for somebody to start spending time on?
I think it depends on their objective. So if you're a solo consultant right now and you're just doing all of the work and there is no differentiation between,
Right.
administrative time and delivery time, if your objective is to eventually hire a team, I think your P&L is not going to be useful until you have several people on your team, because you're going to make decisions that are not based on keeping that in balance. But
Sure.
understanding what your gross margin should look like, and then planning and pricing your services with that in mind before you ever
Mhm.
have to hire anyone is one of the best pieces of advice I can give to a consultant that wants to scale. Because I'm sure we've both seen this time and time again. A consultant gets to a level where they have so much work that they're like, okay, I have to start hiring somebody. And then they realize that they have two major problems. The first is they can't afford to hire anyone because their pricing doesn't allow for that to happen and still having healthy margins. And then they also have to go through all of the leadership, hiring, management, like all of the non-trivial
Mhm.
tactical execution of actually finding people, hiring them, and getting them to
Sure.
produce successful outcomes. So my proposition is, well, let's take that first problem of you not having the money in your pricing. Let's take that off the table right from the start by
Mhm.
understanding the simple levers here, which is set your gross margin up for about 70% on a given service or client, and figure that gross margin out based on what it would cost you to hire other people to wear the hats that you wear in the business, and
Mm.
start keeping track of that so you can get yourself to a place where you can just start making decisions about buying back your time gradually, and you'll know exactly what it's going to cost you. You'll know that you already have the money for it, and you can just start making decisions about what jobs you choose to do on your work and work your way back.
Why 70%? Where's that number come from?
Yeah. So the way I think about this is, first and foremost, too many people try to measure net profit on a per project or per client basis. And to me, that is a fundamentally flawed concept. Firstly, because it's way more work, but secondly, because it actually makes all of your projects and clients horizontally inconsistent. And so you actually lose a really valuable insight in that you can't ever compare one client to another client, because you're factoring a bunch of externalities into the measurement of the profitability that have nothing to do with
Mm.
the project itself. So my argument is, let's focus on gross margin, and then let's price in overhead and utilization fluctuations and so on into that gross margin target. So if you target 70% on a project basis, it's because we know that there's going to be a drop off generally of from the project to the profit and loss statement of anywhere from 10 to 20%. Most of the firms we audit fall right in the middle, so about 15%. So what that means is, if I'm consistently hitting a 70% margin on my projects, then on my P&L, I would expect to make about 15% less than that. Let's call it 55%.
Mhm.
What we also know is that most firms are going to spend anywhere from 20 to 30% of their income on overhead. So that's going to include salaries for sales and marketing, for administration, rent, facilities, lawyers, accountants, all the other things you got to pay for to run the business. So if you subtract, 20 to 30% from that 55%, you're left with a profit margin of ideally 25 to maybe 40% on the high end. Most people are going to fall, if they're performing very, very well, in that 25 to 35% range. So
Right.
that's why we want to target 70 on a per project basis. And then that leaves us the room to kind of work through the rest of those expenses and land in the right place in the P&L. So it's very simple. And that's part of the reason that we set it up that way.
For somebody who might be newer to doing this, maybe they're not tracking really any of these kinds of metrics or numbers right inside of the business, is there any additional advice you would offer around how to start to like think about predicting the profitability of a project, and any differences around how you think, looking at profitability per project versus per client?
Yeah. So on a per project and a per client basis, the fundamentals are going to be essentially the same. It's just that a client might contain multiple projects or multiple, line items of work. But
Mm,
when you're thinking about profitability at that level, really what we have to understand is that we have the scope and we have the price. And those things are related, but they're not actually the same. Often they get conflated as being the same, and often they start to get mixed up in the same document. And so the first thing that we need to do with any engagement is try to get an understanding of the scope. And it's not to say that we need to be able to predict accurately how much time it's going to take to get something done. Even if we sell time and materials, the scope now, what we've done is we've reduced it to an hour. So we have to understand, okay, what will it cost us? And that's the question of scope. What will it cost us to do this work? And if you're doing, let's say, a flat rate project, then it's a question of asking, well, how much time is it going to take me? Let's try to break that down into 4 or 5 buckets that me or my team might spend time on. So most of the time you're thinking of that in terms of roles, like how much time do I spend being the project manager? How much time do I spend being the strategist? How much time do I spend being the copywriter, et cetera? And then thinking about, if I was to hire somebody to do that, what would it
right.
cost me on a per hour basis to hire that out? And that helps us get an understanding of the cost basis for that project. And then the general rule of thumb is multiply that by 3. That gets you to about 66% and round up. Or if you know how to do a margin formula, which is fairly simple, it's the cost divided by 1 minus your margin target. That will give you the minimum price that you need to charge, and then add any pass through on top of that. So that's kind of how you would start thinking about pricing out or setting a floor for the price you need to ask the client on any given project or client. And then measuring the profitability of that is just the reverse. You take a look at how much time you spent, you multiply it by the cost of that time, or the theoretical cost if you're the one doing a lot of the work. And then you get an understanding of, okay, what was
Right.
my margin roughly on this work?
Is there anything that you see firms measuring and spending like a lot of time around and thinking about, but really does not provide that much value?
Yeah, it's overhead. I've almost never seen a firm overspend on overhead. Like generally, an agency or a consulting firm is not the kind of business where you're going to walk into their office and they're going to have $900 Aeron chairs and 17 foosball machines and free catered lunch. Overhead's almost never the problem.
Yeah.
And yet, because they look at their P&L and it's just income and then bottom line, that's generally the first place they go. And there's usually maybe 10% of upside in
Mm,
optimizing for overhead. The real opportunity is in improving their gross margin, but that's generally not where they're focused. And that's where the massive opportunity exists. And there's really only 3 ways to move gross margin and 3 metrics that you can measure to influence that. And that's where we've seen people triple, quadruple their bottom line profit, actually reduce the amount of overtime and weekend work that their teams do, and even have larger budgets to spend on administration, sales and marketing, et cetera, is by focusing on that gross margin and really improving the fundamental profitability
right.
of the business.
So you mentioned there's 3. Can you just describe what those 3 are?
Yeah. So there's 2 that are related with, let's start with the formula for gross margin, right? It's your agency gross income, as we call it, which is revenue minus pass through, minus your delivery cost divided by agency
And
gross
just
income.
sorry, Marcel, just to jump in and interrupt you for a second, but for those that maybe not be familiar with what is pass through, can you just break that down and explain it for a moment?
Yeah. So one of the big mistakes that we see some firms make is they're not differentiating between the money that they collect from clients and then how much of that is their responsibility to earn. So pass through would isolate money that moves through you into external vendors for which you're not responsible for the
Right.
profitability of. So that would be materials. So if you have to go out and buy a website template or a big set of data for an engagement, or you need to spend a bunch of money on print or advertising or hire an external, vendor to do part of the engagement, that would all be considered pass through. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you, let's say, for example, charge the client $10,000 for a Facebook ads campaign, but you spent $5,000 on Facebook ads, your agency gross income would be the $5,000 that's left over. That's
Right.
what you now need to earn with your time. And that's what we want to be measuring profitability against.
Okay.
So once we've isolated those things, there's two metrics that are about increasing the level of revenue that you can handle while keeping your costs the same or not increasing them at the same level. And there's one related with decreasing costs. So I'll start with the boring one, which is how do we decrease our costs? And that's really looking at average cost per hour. So I mentioned earlier, right, the way that we want to think about pricing and scoping work is we take our time, we multiply it by the rate that it would cost us to hire for that time. So the first place to look is how do we decrease the average cost of each hour that's required to service a client? And generally what we do there is we look at what is the level of judgment that's required to go through the process of delivering this outcome? And how do we lower the level of judgment required to accomplish more and more of the tasks in this engagement? And by doing so, we can generally hire less experienced staff, and less experienced staff typically is going to be less expensive. So an example for us, I used to do all the work on an audit, about 40 hours of work. As we built processes and documentation and technology, an account manager that costs about half of what I cost was able to do more than half of that work now. And I just come in and do the very high leverage stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. That's perfect.
So average cost per hour, if you're hiring a lot of freelancers, you'll feel that immediately in your profitability. If you're hiring a team, you're going to feel that over a longer time horizon, as your total payroll will be lower at scale because the composition of your team will be less senior. So that's the first one, but that one's not very exciting. So the other two are
actually, so I got to jump in, but like, to me, that's pretty exciting because I mean, that's such a key, it's critical, right? To scale, to grow any kind of business, especially in the consulting kind of professional services world. Systems, processes, things of that nature is what allows you to scale and to hire and to train, like all these benefits. So yeah, I don't think it's boring at all, but let's go to number two.
All right. So number two, we're now talking about, well, how do we make more money with the team that we already have without, making any changes to that? So the first one we want to pay attention to is what I call average billable rate. And this is essentially a way to measure, no matter how you price, whether you bill by the hour or you do value-based pricing or you do retainers or you bill on Trident layers, whatever it is, how much money did you make and how much time did it take you to complete the work for the client? And when you do that math across different clients, different projects, you start to see patterns in terms of, well, we make $250 an hour when we build websites, but we only make $98 an hour when we do SEO work. And you can start to get an insight into what kinds of projects, clients, teams are earning revenue more or less efficiently. And what I love about this metric is all you need is roughly, what was the AGI and roughly how much time do we spend? And you can look at any section of the business.
When you say AGI?
Agency gross income. So this is the same thing that we were talking about earlier in gross margin. Right. It's your revenue minus pass through. So as long as you can isolate those two data points, you can look at a week, a month, a quarter, a year, and you can look at one client, 10 clients, an entire team, the entire business. You can slice and dice the business however you want. It's really inexpensive. It doesn't require a lot of inputs. You don't have to run everything through the accounting system, and you can start to get really frequent insight into what's happening in the business and really get an understanding of where to focus.
And how do you find people are able to track that? So, I mean, and of course there's software and tools and like time tracking, right? I mean, you guys have some software as well. I know that your clients use, but let's say for somebody who just is newer to this, doesn't have a massive budget to invest on the tech side, what would be a starting point? Like, what should they be thinking about and what should they actually be doing to track that kind of information so they can start to see and analyze it?
It's a great question. And if really, when you think about it, it's like the specificity of the data that you need really comes down to what level you want to measure this at. So if we kept things really simple and we said, I just want to know what the average billable rate is on every project that we do, then really all you need to have is a spreadsheet in which you input what was our AGI for this client and what's the total amount of time that was tracked towards that client. And there's tons of time tracking tools that are anywhere from cheap to free. So as long as you have that, or even just you punch the time directly into that spreadsheet, now you can start to get this insight. And it's such an inexpensive but powerful way to get really great visibility into what's working and what's not working in the business. And so if you think about that for a second, if you notice, hey, we have a service that we make $100 an hour on average, and we have another one over here that we make two. Well, if your entire team started only doing the things that paid you $200 an hour, you would effectively double the amount of revenue that you can do without changing any of your costs.
Right.
So it seems a little too easy, but it really is that powerful.
Yeah. It just reminds me of the whole like 80-20 kind of, principle, in action, right? The challenge is not that whether something like this exists, it's just finding it. And if you can pay attention in almost any business, there's going to be a whole bunch of these levers that like you just adjust one and it has a pretty significant, impact. So I love that. All right, let's get to number 3.
Okay. Number 3 is utilization rate. So this will apply to you if you have a team, but essentially utilization rate is looking at, okay, we have a certain amount of capacity that we buy from our team, and how much of that is being used towards earning that average billable rate that we just talked about. And so, of course, if you think about it, if I have a team of, let's say, 5 people working full time, that's about 10,000 hours of capacity. If I'm 50% utilized and I make an average of $100 per hour, then that team can handle $500,000 worth of revenue. But if I can increase that to 60%, now we can do $600,000, but none of our costs have changed. So that $600,000, for all intents and purposes, flows to the bottom line. So that's a really important one to pay attention to, because we find that, especially as agencies start to scale, they can get out over their skis quite a bit in terms of staffing, especially when they're small and each hire adds an incrementally like very, very significant amount of capacity, and it can take them a while to fill that up. And so paying attention to utilization, using elastic capacity or freelancers as you scale to make sure you're not paying for too much capacity that ends up not being utilized to generate revenue is a really important thing. And this is where we've seen clients that do project accounting. They're thinking, well, we're knocking out of the park. Our average billable rates or our margins are great on every single project, and yet we're still not making money. What the heck is going on? And utilization is usually the culprit in that case.
So we're talking about hiring. One challenge that people are often kind of, dealing with, and wrestling with is the idea of bringing in people, right, before you potentially need them. Like it's that kind of chicken or egg, give or take. It's like a bit of that forecasting. And so I'm wondering, with all the work that you've done with clients over the years, any tips or any kind of effective ways or best practices of how somebody should start to think about the idea of forecasting and kind of set themselves up to be better equipped in terms of when to actually hire or start to thinking about hiring and kind of putting those pieces together?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the first thing that we work with clients on before we even get to measuring those feedback loops I talked about. The first step is forecasting, because you think about it, you can't measure utilization unless you understand your capacity, and you can't measure average billable rates unless you understand the expectations for projects. And when we take expectations for projects and a model for capacity and we put them together, what we get is a forecast. The problem that I see most people have with forecasting is they try to do it in a bottom-up way. And this is how most of the software tools that are for resource planning are going to do this. Take a project, break it down into 100 tasks, assign those tasks to individual people, all to get back up to this insight of what are things going to look like over the next 3 months. And of course, that's a really inefficient way to get to that insight. And if anything changes, the maintenance cost is astronomical. So I see bottom-up resource planning as a really effective tool for, short time intervals on mature work that's already scoped and priced and sold and it's confirmed. And that's really to get an understanding of what are we doing over the next couple of weeks. But to forecast out over the long term, I encourage people to take a top-down approach, where instead of thinking about work at an individual level, you're coming back to remember those couple of buckets I talked about when we talked about scoping and pricing? What are those 4 or 5 different hats that you or your team wears? If you can just estimate those things and then think about your capacity in those broad buckets, then it's much faster to say, okay, we have this work in the pipeline. It's roughly this amount of time. And then map that to, okay, we know we have 40 hours of design time per month. We know we have 60 hours of project management time per month. How is this adding up? There's way less friction, and you can maintain a broader time horizon and also a higher level of uncertainty in the work without all of the friction of trying to like adjust 100 tasks every time a project timeline moves around, or we want to run a scenario on what if we get this, what if we don't. So I wrote a whole article on this on our blog, but that's my advice: is simplify, focus on accuracy over precision when you're looking at long-term forecasting and trying to get ahead of those decisions.
So Marcel, we'll get that link from you afterwards, and we'll link that up so that people can go to the show notes afterwards and check that out in your blog to get more detail on that. All right, so This is great. I mean, I know there's a lot more information you guys have around profitability on your blog or podcast or so forth, which we'll link people to. Talk about the kind of your plans for this business right now for Periquito. Is your goal to continue kind of building the team, growing it? Is your plans to keep building it to a certain level and then sell it? Like, what are you thinking about the future of this business?
Yeah, we get asked about that question all the time of, are we building to sell or are we building to hold? And the way I see this is, we're building this to be a great business that we never have to sell, so that if we do sell, we get an incredible multiple, because it's actually going to have to be a damn good offer. But we're not building a business that will be a failure if we never have some kind of liquidity event. So maybe I'll run this business for the next 30 years. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to exit that's aligned with our values and our vision, and that is aligned for what we want. So I can't answer that question, but what I can tell you is the vision for Periquito, which is that we really believe that the industry and how professional services are run has changed, but the way we measure those businesses has not caught up. And we need a new framework for how to measure agencies. We believe that we've developed that framework. And so it's to establish that new methodology for measuring an agency, to build the technology platform that supports the implementation of that methodology, and then to go out and try to educate as many people as possible on how to do this so they can all reap the benefits. And that's going to include creating a ton of competition for ourselves at the consulting level. Like, we want to disrupt ourselves out of being the people that do the consulting around this, and hopefully empower every CFO firm, lots of technology companies, lots of other consultants, to be able to go in and help professional services firms measure and understand and act on these kinds of insights, and ultimately run a better business.
Well, I know you don't have the book yet, but I am looking forward to seeing the book whenever that comes out, as we were chatting earlier. All right, so before we wrap up, just a couple more questions for you. I'm wondering, with everything that you have going on, I know we talked before that you're involved not only in Periquito, but you're involved in a few other kind of businesses and so forth. What are one or two things that you do on a daily basis that you feel really kind of contributes to you being able to show up on a daily basis, being effective, being productive, and just kind of, working at that level of performance that aligns with what you want to create and kind of higher levels of success?
Yeah, I'll talk about the optimizations in a moment, but I'll start by saying that diet, sleep, and exercise are 90% of it. I'm meticulous about my sleep, temperature, light, what I eat. Like, I get 8 hours every night, and I measure my sleep performance. That's probably the most important thing that I do.
How are you measuring? Are you doing an Oura ring, a Whoop, 8 Sleep? What's your go-to?
Yeah, I'm on Whoop. I tried 8 Sleep, and I found that it didn't work as well for me as just having an AC unit directly in my room that I could set on a timer and just have the optimal temperature in the room. But yeah, Whoop is how I measure sleep performance. And of course, I do all the journaling. So I'm getting feedback on what are things that are affecting my sleep in one direction or another. And then, of course, timing cold showers during the day. So, it sounds like you might also be a Huberman Lab fan. So all of the stuff around temperature and light throughout the day, I'm subscribed to all of that. And it really has made a huge difference. Regular exercise and diet. Like, the way I look at this is, I look around and I'm like, so many people would be in better health if they just stopped actively killing themselves. So that's kind of my first step, is like, don't start by not doing things that are detrimental to my health in terms of what I eat and my lifestyle and habits and so on. And then start focusing on optimization, which is, supplementation and, some of these other things. And so what I do on that front is, I have a quarterly meeting with my naturopath. We do blood work, and we tweak my supplementation regimen based on the feedback that we're getting from the blood work, and red light therapy on a regular basis. And those are kind of the things that take me a little bit to that next level.
All right. And then over the last 6 months or so, one book, could be fiction or nonfiction, that you read or listened to, really enjoyed, and think that others might as well.
I got to give a shout out to my good friend, Dan Marcel, with Buy Back Your Time. It truly is. I'm very biased because him and I are good friends, but it truly is going to be, I think, one of those kind of top 10 business books that every entrepreneur ends up reading, like The 4-Day Work Week, like Good to Great. It's really at that level. And these are things that, I was fortunate enough to have a front row seat to that when I was early in my career. And these are things that Dan has been living for as long as I've known him. And they've really enabled me to be where I am in my career. And so it's really cool for me to see it packaged in such a way that it can reach the masses and make the impact that it's been making.
All right. Well, Marcel, so we will link that up, as well as your blog post and anything else that you want to send over that we should, direct people towards. We'll make sure to also have a link to your the Periquito website. anything else that you want to direct people to, or a specific URL they want them to check out?
I mentioned earlier, we have our lead magnet, the toolkit. And of course, it's our lead magnet. So you're going to get all kinds of emails from me. You can unsubscribe from them, but it's genuinely really, really, really valuable. We've had people tell us like we should be selling it instead of giving it away for free. But if you're interested in measuring any of the things that I've talked about today, or going deeper into how to do that, we have spreadsheet templates, cheat sheets, and training videos inside the toolkit to help you get those things implemented. So you're welcome to go grab that. It's absolutely free at periquito.com/toolkit. And I'll leave a link for you to put wherever it goes.
Sounds good. All right. Well, Marcel, thanks again so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Mike. It's been great.